This is the 7th of 8 video revision sessions for the theory paper, which will help you with your mock exam on the afternoon of Friday the 2nd of February 2018 and your real exam on the morning of Monday the 18th of June 2018. This video is the first video about communication, and it covers the purpose of communication, the importance of communication, benefits of communication, channels of communication, methods of communication, and barriers to communication. Before we start, communication is absolutely vital in BCS. It's in the name, Business Communication Systems, and it's really important that you understand why communication is important in business. So first of all, the purpose of communication. Why does a business need to communicate? Well, it needs to communicate in order to gain information or data from inside and outside the business. So it has to communicate in order to gain that information or that data in order for it to work as a business. It also needs to pass on information or data to others inside or outside the business. So communication is vital. So who does a business communicate with? Well, internally, its internal communication occurs between employees and owners. Externally, communication happens between suppliers, between the local community, between the business and the competitors, between the business and government, and between business and customers. So there's lots of really important communication going on here, both internally and externally. So, the importance of communication. In good communication, the information or data should have the following features. First of all, it must be clear. It also must be accurate, and it must create the image and tone the business wants to convey. If information is not passed from the sender to the recipient properly, then problems might arise, like it might be misunderstood, it might actually be misleading, and it might be misinterpreted. So, what are the benefits of good communication? Write down now some of the things that you think are benefits of having good communication by a business. So some of those benefits of good communication can be well-informed employees, and well-informed employees are more likely to be motivated and want to do well for your business. Customers who are well-informed about the products are likely to become loyal customers, loyal to the business, and spend more money with you. So it's important to communicate effectively with customers. And communication with suppliers who know the requirements of their customers can provide a better service. So your suppliers, if you communicate effectively with them, they will know exactly what they need or what you need from them, and they'll be able to provide that better service for you. So there's different channels of communication, and we've covered this before in lessons. Write down as many channels of communication as you can think of and try and explain what they are. So some of these channels of communication, first of all, we've got formal communication. Formal communication might be a piece of communication that is needed in the future. For example, minutes from a meeting or a written letter. It usually uses professional words and professional tone. That's formal communication. Informal communication. This does not need to be recorded. It might be a passing conversation that you have with the boss in the corridor or something along those lines. It's very informal. You might have confidential communication, and this is where information is restricted to only those people who are meant to know about it. The opposite to that is non-confidential, and this is information that is not restricted. Anybody's allowed to know about it. We've also got urgent communication. Urgent communication means that it needs immediate attention. Something has to be acted upon right away. And of course the opposite to that is non-urgent, which means that it doesn't need immediate attention. In fact, it might not even need any attention at all. It might just be for information purposes. So, methods of communication. So we've got a variety of different methods of communication. It says a business must consider the content of the message and its audience, who is it intended for, before deciding which method of communication they should use. Write down 4 different methods of communication now, pause the video and make sure that you've got some good examples. So, some examples of methods of communication. You could have oral communication or verbal communication, which is the same thing. You could have visual communication, written communication. Written communication also means it could be typed. And graphical communication. It says each method of communication has many examples as well as advantages and disadvantages. So we're going to have a look at some of those examples now. So if you have a look at oral in the top left hand corner, oral or verbal communication can happen through telephone calls. It can happen in face-to-face meetings. Formal meetings will have an agenda and minutes will be taken, or it might be a very informal meeting. Or teleconferencing, where you speak across the telephone. We've already done a revision session, a revision video on that. So that might be having a telephone conversation with more than 2 or 3 people. Written communication, different methods of written communication might be creating a memo, which will be an internal written form of communication. It might be a professional letter, which will be an external form of written communication. Financial documents, email messages, text messages, these are all written forms of communication. So in the bottom left hand corner we've got visual. That could be video conferencing, where you actually get to see the person, rather than the telephone conferencing or the teleconferencing where you don't see the person, you just hear and speak to them. Visual communication would mean that you actually see them, so video conferencing. Perhaps electronic notice boards, where you see those notice boards change with the important information that the business is trying to get across to maybe employees or customers even. PowerPoint presentations are visual, and websites often also include visual methods of communication. And finally we've got graphical communication. This can include graphs and charts, it include flow charts, it include production drawings, things that are very much images and graphical forms of communicating. So we've got different advantages and disadvantages, and very briefly we're going to go through the advantages and disadvantages of oral, visual, written and graphical communication. So the advantages of oral communication is that you get instant feedback. As soon as you ask somebody a question, they might take a few seconds to think about the answer, but straight away they're really going to answer you back, and you get that instant feedback. Disadvantages are that the sender and the receiver might actually speak different languages, and so there's a barrier straight away. And it could be difficult to keep a record of what has been said in an oral communication. It might be that you record it on a sound recorder or something like that, but it can be difficult to keep a record of what's said. Visual communication, an advantage is that time can be saved on travelling to meetings. You can actually see people, maybe through your video conferencing. And the disadvantages of that are, if the technology for video conferencing fails, it's maybe faulty or it's not compatible, then communication will not happen. Written communication, the advantages are that you could record the communication and it could be kept for future reference. That might be keeping a letter or keeping the memo so that you can return to it in future. Disadvantages are that the sender cannot be sure that the message actually reaches the correct receiver and was even interpreted correctly. Sometimes it's difficult to read what somebody has written, particularly in the tone that they've written it, and so interpreting that message correctly can be difficult if it's just written. It's a lot easier to interpret a message when it's been verbally or orally given to you. Written communication is more difficult to interpret the way in which it's been sent. Graphical communication. The advantages are that non-specialists can access complex information. If you've written or if you've drawn or produced, a graph correctly, then anybody should be able to read the information on that graph. Even a technical drawing of maybe a building, people should be able to more or less be able to read what is going in each room, how big the room is, things like that. So non-specialists can access those complex bits of information by looking at the graphics. The disadvantages are that graphical media is suitable for a very limited range of communications. It is really only for your graphs and your charts and maybe those technical drawings of buildings or products that you're going to sell. So lastly, we're going to look at barriers to communication. Barriers to communication are things that stop communication happening. Pause the video now and write down as many things as you can remember that could be barriers to communication that we've covered in lessons. So, barriers to communication. Some of these could be jargon. Jargon is those keywords that maybe people inside your business or maybe only inside your department in a business understand. It'll be keywords that if you were to say to customers, they just wouldn't understand what you're talking about. So that really can be a barrier to communicating effectively. Background noise. Poor communication channel or method chosen. So if you chose the wrong communication channel or the wrong method for a particular type of communication, then that could be a barrier to communication. Maybe you should have spoken to somebody instead of writing it down, or maybe you should have produced a graph or a chart instead of speaking to somebody. So poor communication channel or method. Inappropriate presentation, so you presented something inappropriately. Faulty equipment, so if we're talking about video conferencing or teleconferencing, we've got faulty equipment, that is a barrier to communication. It will stop communication happening straight away. Poor phone signal, seems an obvious one. If you're out and about in the van and you've got to call the office or you've got to call your customers, poor phone signal will be a barrier to communication. No battery, now this might be in your laptop or it might be in your mobile phone. That would stop communication, particularly if you're going to email somebody, if you're going to speak to someone or text someone. Cultural differences can be a massive barrier to communication, particularly if your business deals with people around the world. And finally, another obvious one, language barrier. If you speak a different language to somebody, then that could be a real barrier to communication if they don't understand what you're trying to tell them. So the last bit says, checking documents for errors in your business is a good idea. Errors can also be a barrier. They can make messages misleading and they can become confusing. So how do we do that? Errors in spelling, punctuation and grammar makes a business look very unprofessional, and that can be a barrier to communication. Errors in tone, for example, a formal business letter needs to use formal business language. Factual errors, so this can cause big problems. Giving out misleading information could damage the business's reputation and could even be a criminal offence. And finally, problems with graphics and diagrams. This could add confusion and customers may not buy from the business again. So it's really important that these 4 areas are covered and considered when thinking about barriers to communication and making sure that errors don't become a barrier in your business.